What if the ultimate punishment became the perfect revenge? In 1885, a ruthless railroad tycoon banished his supposedly slow-witted, mixed-race daughter to a desolate Wyoming ranch. Expecting her to fade away, he thought he was tossing out the trash. Instead, he handed his worst enemy the key to his empire. San Francisco in 1885 was a city of glittering wealth and dark, hidden secrets. At the top of Nob Hill sat the sprawling estate of Emerson Pendleton, a magnate who had built his fortune on the steel rails of the Western expansion. Emerson was a man of terrifying ambition, known to crush unions, sabotage competitors, and buy out politicians before breakfast. But inside his mahogany-paneled mansion, Emerson harbored a secret that bruised his colossal ego. His daughter. Grace. Grace was the product of Emerson's brief, hidden relationship with a Chinese immigrant woman who had worked in his early mining camps. When her mother died of consumption, Emerson was forced to take the child in. To the elite circles of California, a mixed-race daughter was a scandal. To Emerson, she was a liability. To survive the brutal, unforgiving environment of her father's home, Grace made a calculated, life-saving decision. At the tender age of 8, she retreated into silence. She played the part of a tragically slow-witted, mute girl. She let her shoulders slump, kept her eyes glued to the floorboards, and never spoke more than a stammered, single-syllable word. Society wives whispered that the tycoon's daughter was touched in the head, a tragic defect of the mind. Emerson, deeply ashamed, kept her locked away in the estate's sprawling library, out of sight and out of mind. But it was his biggest mistake. Surrounded by thousands of books, legal volumes, and discarded copies of her father's corporate ledgers, Grace educated herself, while Emerson thought she was staring blankly at the fireplace. She was memorizing property laws, corporate loopholes, and the intricate, often illegal, accounting tricks her father used to bankrupt his rivals. She possessed a photographic memory and a brilliant, strategic mind. She knew every dirty secret of the Pendleton Railroad Company. By the time Grace turned 19, Emerson's sights were set on a massive expansion through Sweetwater County, Wyoming. There was only one obstacle, a sprawling, thousands of acres cattle operation called the Iron Creek Ranch. It sat directly in the middle of the only viable mountain pass. The owner was a rugged, solitary cowboy named Caleb Lawson. Caleb was 32, a man hardened by harsh winters and a lifetime of grueling labor. He had inherited the ranch, along with a crippling $15,000 debt held by none other than Emerson Pendleton's bank. For 2 years, Caleb had stubbornly fought off Emerson's aggressive buyout offers, working himself to the bone to make the agonizingly high interest payments. Emerson was losing patience. The railroad expansion was bleeding money with every month of delay. Sitting in his smoke-filled study, Emerson devised a plan so cruel, so underhanded, that even his hardened lawyers blanched. He sent a contract to Wyoming with an ultimatum. He would forgive the $15,000 debt entirely and leave the Iron Creek Ranch alone. On one condition, Caleb had to marry Emerson's daughter. Emerson's logic was delightfully malicious. He would finally rid his mansion of the embarrassing, stupid daughter who stained his reputation. More importantly, he knew the brutal Wyoming winter was approaching. He calculated that burdening a struggling, solitary rancher with a helpless, mentally deficient wife would drive Caleb over the edge. Emerson firmly believed Caleb would either abandon the ranch in frustration, or the harsh conditions would lead to a tragedy, leaving the land ripe for the taking. It was a death sentence disguised as a dowry. When the telegram arrived at Iron Creek, Caleb was backed into a corner. The bank was threatening foreclosure by month's end. With a heavy heart and a sense of deep dread, he signed the paper. He didn't want a wife. He certainly didn't want a Pendleton. 2 weeks later, the train hissed to a halt at the dusty, wind-swept depot in Cheyenne. Caleb stood on the wooden platform, his collar turned up against the biting autumn wind, expecting to meet a haughty, spoiled heiress sent to spy on him. Instead, the train conductor practically led a frail-looking young woman down the steps. Grace wore a plain, ash-gray dress that was entirely too thin for the Wyoming chill. She kept her head bowed, clutching a single, battered leather valise. When Caleb approached and tipped his hat, stating his name, Grace merely offered a vacant, wide-eyed stare and a slight, trembling nod. "Mister, Pendleton's men told me you struggle with your words." "Mum," Caleb said, his deep voice carrying a mixture of exhaustion and unexpected pity. "My wagon is over here. It's a long ride. You best take my coat." He draped his heavy sheepskin jacket over her shoulders. Grace didn't speak, but as she climbed into the wagon, she stole a glance at him. Beneath her perfectly crafted mask of dull obedience, her sharp eyes catalogued everything: the calluses on his hands, the fraying reins of his horses, the deep lines of stress etched around his eyes. He wasn't the monster her father claimed. He was just a man fighting for his life. The journey to Iron Creek was long and silent, as the sprawling, rugged beauty of the Wyoming plains unfolded before her. Grace felt something she hadn't experienced in over a decade, the faint, terrifying spark of freedom. The first month at Iron Creek Ranch was a delicate, silent dance. True to her father's predictions, the ranch was isolated, the work was backbreaking, and the impending winter loomed like a dark shadow over the valley. Caleb, despite his grueling schedule, treated Grace with a surprising, quiet dignity. Believing the rumors that she had the mind of a child, he never raised his voice, never demanded anything of her, and set up a warm, private room for her near the kitchen stove. He gave her the simplest of tasks: peeling potatoes, scattering feed for the chickens, folding laundry, and praised her gently when she completed them. "You're doing just fine, Grace," he would say, placing a cup of hot coffee on the table for her before heading out into the freezing pre-dawn darkness. Grace maintained her facade flawlessly. She dropped plates occasionally, stared blankly at the walls when he was in the room, and spoke only in soft, hesitant hums. But when Caleb rode out to the pastures, the mask vanished. Alone in the cabin, Grace moved with swift, calculated precision. She explored the ranch house, her keen eyes taking in the reality of Caleb's situation. She found his ledger books stacked haphazardly on a desk in the corner. One afternoon, while Caleb was out mending fences miles away, she opened them. The handwriting was rough, the math rudimentary, but as she flipped through the pages, comparing his cattle sales to the freight charges levied by the local transport companies, Grace's blood ran cold. She recognized the freight company's name immediately: Western Pacific Logistics. It was a shell company secretly owned by her father. Emerson wasn't just waiting for Caleb to fail, he was actively bleeding him dry, charging him triple the standard rate to ship his beef to market, ensuring Caleb could never turn a profit. Grace also found the deed to Iron Creek and the marriage contract Caleb had signed. As she read the fine print, her eyes narrowed. There was a hidden reversion clause buried in the legal jargon. If the marriage was annulled, or if either party perished within the first year, The land defaulted immediately to the Pendleton estate, regardless of the forgiven debt. Her father had set a trap. He was banking on her dying in the wilderness. Anger, hot and fierce, finally broke through the cold walls she had built around her heart. Caleb Lawson was a good man being systematically destroyed by a tyrant, and Emerson Pendleton had made the fatal mistake of sending the one person who knew exactly how to dismantle his empire right into the heart of the battlefield. The turning point came in late November. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the first major blizzard of the season slammed into the Sweetwater Valley with ferocious violence. Caleb had gone out to herd a group of strays into the lower barn. Hours passed. The wind howled like a wounded animal, rattling the windows of the cabin. When the door finally burst open, Caleb collapsed onto the floorboards, covered in snow, his face pale and contorted in agony. His horse had slipped on a patch of black ice, rolling over his leg and crushing his ribs. He was trapped, badly injured, and the storm was projected to last for days. As a fever set in that night, Caleb lay in his bed, looking at Grace, who sat quietly by the fire. "Grace," he rasped, his breathing shallow. "The calves. In the south pen. They'll freeze if the heaters aren't lit. I can't walk." He closed his eyes, a tear of sheer frustration escaping. "I'm sorry to put this on you. I know you don't understand." He expected her to panic, to cry, or to simply sit there in her usual silent confusion. He passed out shortly after, resigning himself to the loss of his livelihood. When Caleb woke up 2 days later, the fever had broken. The storm outside had died down to a whisper. He braced himself for the worst, expecting to find the house freezing and his livestock dead. Instead, the cabin was sweltering warm. The smell of rich venison stew filled the air. And there, sitting at his desk, bathed in the morning light, was Grace. But she wasn't staring blankly. She held a pen in her hand, writing furiously in one of his ledgers. Beside her was a neat stack of newly drawn-up contracts and supply manifests. Caleb pushed himself up, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "Grace," he croaked. She stopped writing. She carefully placed the pen back in its inkwell, closed the ledger, and turned to look at him. The dull, vacant expression she had worn for 19 years was entirely gone. Her eyes were sharp, intelligent, and blazing with quiet intensity. "You have 3 fractured ribs and a severe sprain in your left tibia. Mr. Lawson," she said. Her voice was steady, resonant, and carried the refined, articulate cadence of a highly educated woman. "I set the bone as best as I could while you were unconscious. The calves in the south pen are warm, the heaters are fueled, and I rationed the grain to last us through the week." Caleb stared at her, his jaw physically dropping. He blinked, wondering if the fever had driven him mad. You can speak." "I have always been able to speak." "Caleb," Grace replied, standing up and walking to his bedside. "And I can read, which is why I spent the last 48 hours restructuring your debts." She handed him a sheet of paper. Caleb, still in shock, looked down at a perfectly formatted financial strategy that bypassed the Pendleton shell companies entirely, routing his cattle through a smaller, independent freight line out of Colorado that he hadn't even known existed. "My father sent me here because he thinks I'm a silent, stupid creature," Grace said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "He thinks he has cornered you, but he forgot one crucial detail. Caleb, I know every single hidden asset, illegal contract and weak point in his entire operation. And if you are willing to trust me, we are going to take everything he has." Caleb looked from the brilliant, detailed financial plan in his hands to the fierce, beautiful woman standing before him. The helpless, slow-witted girl was an illusion. The woman standing in his cabin was a weapon, and she was finally ready to go to war. The revelation in the cabin shifted the very foundation of Iron Creek Ranch. For Caleb Lawson, the sudden transformation of his wife from a silent, fragile burden into a fierce, brilliant strategist was nothing short of a miracle. As Caleb's ribs healed over the brutal winter months of early 1886, the ranch house became a war room. By day, Grace maintained her facade whenever the ranch hands or supply drivers were near. She would don her oversized, drab apron, stare vacantly at the flour bin, and offer only nervous nods to anyone who spoke to her. But the moment the door bolted shut at night, the oil lamps burned bright, and Grace went to work, using Caleb's name. Grace drafted a series of highly coded telegrams that Caleb rode 50 miles to send from a neighboring county, ensuring they couldn't be traced by the telegraph operator in Cheyenne, whom Emerson undoubtedly bribed. Her target was none other than Jay Gould, the legendary and utterly ruthless Wall Street Railroad financier. Gould was Emerson Pendleton's fiercest rival, a man who had been desperately trying to break Emerson's monopoly in the West. Grace possessed the one thing Gould lacked: Emerson's internal expansion maps. "My father is bleeding capital," Grace explained one evening, tracing a map she had drawn entirely from memory on their kitchen table. "He overleveraged his assets to buy out the local politicians here in Sweetwater. He assumes this mountain pass will be his salvation. If we sell the exact coordinates of his proposed tunnels to Jay Gould, Gould can buy up the crucial adjoining land parcels through dummy corporations. By spring, my father's planned route will be entirely blocked by federal injunctions." Caleb watched her, captivated. The firelight danced in her dark hair, highlighting the fierce determination in her eyes. He had expected to spend his life alone, fighting the dirt and the banks. Now, he found himself falling deeply, irrevocably in love with a woman whose mind was as vast and untamed as the Wyoming frontier. "He's going to find out it was us." "Grace," Caleb warned, his voice low but steady. "Emerson isn't a man who loses quietly. When he realizes Iron Creek isn't bankrupt, he'll send his enforcers." "Let him send them," Grace replied, her gaze meeting his with unwavering confidence. "I know how his enforcers think because I read their payroll ledgers for 10 years. We will be ready." The first test came in March, during the spring thaw. Emerson Pendleton dispatched Josiah Miller, his chief legal enforcer, a cold, sharp-eyed man known for terrorizing homesteaders into signing away their deeds. Josiah rode into the muddy yard of Iron Creek, expecting to find a destitute Caleb and a half-dead Grace. Grace saw him coming from the kitchen window. She immediately dropped a cast-iron skillet, letting it clatter loudly onto the floor, and rubbed ashes onto her cheeks, slumping her shoulders. Josiah didn't even knock. He pushed the front door open, an arrogant sneer on his face. "Lawson, I'm here to collect on the Pendleton bank loan. The grace period is over." Caleb stepped out from the back room, wiping grease from his hands. He looked calmer, healthier, and far more imposing than Josiah had anticipated. "The loan is paid. Miller, the draft was sent to the Cheyenne Bank yesterday morning." Josiah froze. "Paid with what money your freight costs alone should have starved you out by December." "Found a new buyer in Colorado. Better rates." Caleb lied smoothly, crossing his arms. Josiah's eyes darted around the cabin, looking for a weakness. They landed on Grace, who was currently sitting on a stool in the corner, rhythmically humming and swaying slightly, pretending to aggressively scrub a perfectly clean spoon. Josiah laughed, a cruel, harsh sound. I see the boss's idiot daughter is still breathing. Pity. A harsh winter might have put the poor, dumb creature out of her misery, and saved us all some paperwork. Caleb's jaw clenched. His hand instinctively twitched toward the Colt revolver, holstered at his hip, a primal urge to defend his wife surging through him. But Grace, without breaking her vacant stare, intentionally dropped the spoon. As it bounced near Caleb's boot, she let out a loud, distressed whimper, breaking the tension. Caleb remembered the plan. He took a deep breath and stepped between Josiah and Grace. "My wife is none of your concern," Caleb growled. "You have your money. Now get off my land before you find out how protective I am of what's mine." Josiah sneered, turning on his heel. "Emerson Pendleton won't like this. Lawson, you haven't won. You've just delayed the inevitable." After the door slammed shut and the sound of hoofbeats faded, Grace stopped swaying. She stood up, brushed the ashes from her cheeks, and looked at Caleb. Her hands were trembling, not from fear, but from suppressed rage. Caleb walked over, gently taking her hands in his calloused ones. "He's gone," he said softly. Grace looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "For 19 years. I listened to them call me those names. I swallowed every insult to survive in that house." Caleb reached into his vest pocket. He pulled out a simple, beautifully polished silver ring he had commissioned a local blacksmith to make from a melted-down family heirloom. He slid it onto Grace's finger. "You are a Pendleton by blood, Grace, but you are a Lawson by choice," Caleb said, his voice thick with emotion. "And in this house, you are the smartest person in the room. Always." Grace pulled him into a desperate, fiercely loving kiss. The war wasn't over, but the lines were drawn, and Emerson Pendleton had no idea he was walking into a trap set by the daughter he had discarded. By May of 1886, the gilded walls of the Pendleton estate in San Francisco were closing in on Emerson. A wave of unprecedented chaos had suddenly gripped the Western financial markets, and Emerson's sprawling empire was the epicenter. His stock plummeted by the hour as Jay Gould, the legendary Wall Street financier, aggressively outmaneuvered him at every turn. Gould seemed to possess a supernatural foresight, snapping up the exact, precise parcels of Wyoming land Emerson desperately needed for his Sweetwater expansion. Worse still, Emerson's secret shell companies, the very lifeblood of his illicit wealth, were being systematically audited. Federal regulators in Washington, acting on highly detailed, anonymous tips mailed from Colorado, were dismantling his extortion rackets. Emerson's chief counsel, a ruthless attorney named Sterling, burst into the mahogany-paneled study one morning. His face pale and slick with sweat. "The feds have frozen Western Pacific logistics. Emerson." Sterling gasped, clutching a handful of telegrams. Someone provided them with the master ledgers. They know about the bribes to Senator Higgins. They know about the freight gouging. We are hemorrhaging capital, and the Sweetwater Pass is completely landlocked by Gould's dummy corporations. Emerson shattered his crystal whiskey glass against the fireplace. He was a man who prided himself on absolute control, yet he was being dismantled by an invisible ghost. Desperate to salvage the cornerstone of his remaining wealth, the Wyoming Pass, Emerson realized he had only one card left to play: Iron Creek. If Caleb Lawson wouldn't sell, Emerson intended to take it by force. He would utilize the hidden reversion clause in the marriage contract, claiming Caleb had breached the terms by failing to adequately care for his dependent, feeble-minded daughter. Emerson ordered his private luxury train prepped. He gathered Sterling and a half-dozen heavily armed Pinkerton guards and steamed toward Cheyenne, intent on crushing a simple cattle rancher to save his legacy. The showdown took place 3 days later in the grand lobby of the Cheyenne National Bank. Emerson, dressed in a bespoke charcoal suit, his face mottled red with stress and fury, stood before the terrified bank manager, Mr. Abernathy. The Pinkertons flanked the doors, their hands resting menacingly on their holstered revolvers. "I am executing a seizure of the Iron Creek deed," Emerson bellowed, slamming a thick legal injunction onto Abernathy's desk. "Caleb Lawson is entirely bankrupt. Furthermore, the marriage is a sham. Lawson lacks the financial stability to care for my disabled daughter, rendering the original contract null and void. Transfer the deed to my name immediately." Abernathy trembled, adjusting his spectacles. "Mr. Pendleton, sir, I assure you, there has been a profound misunderstanding regarding Mr. Lawson's accounts." Before the manager could finish, the heavy oak doors of the bank swung open, pushing past the Pinkerton guards. Caleb Lawson walked in. He did not look like a broken, destitute homesteader. He wore a finely tailored western suit, his boots spurring loudly against the marble floor, radiating the formidable authority of a prosperous cattle baron. But it was the woman walking beside him that brought the entire room to a dead, breathless halt. Grace wore a striking, impeccably tailored navy blue riding habit, the fine silk catching the morning light. Her dark hair was swept up in an elegant, commanding style. She did not slump her shoulders. She did not keep her eyes glued to the floorboards. She walked with the lethal grace of a predator, stepping directly up to the man who had banished her. Emerson blinked, genuinely confused. He squinted at the woman, his brain refusing to process the image before him. "Grace," he whispered, his voice cracking. "Good morning, Father." Grace spoke. Her voice rang through the silent, vaulted ceiling of the bank like a silver bell, clear, articulate, and terrifyingly steady. "Mr." Abernathy gasped. Sterling, the ruthless lawyer, stared in slack-jawed disbelief. Emerson himself physically stumbled backward, clutching the edge of the mahogany desk as if he had been struck by lightning. You spoke," Emerson stammered, the color completely draining from his face. "You just spoke, fluently, since I was a young child," Grace replied coldly, her eyes locking onto his with unwavering intensity. She unclasped her leather satchel and pulled out a massive sheaf of meticulously organized legal documents, slapping them down right on top of Emerson's injunction. "What is the meaning of this?" Emerson demanded, his voice rising in panic as he looked from the papers to his daughter. "You're an imbecile. You have the mind of a child. You haven't spoken a complete sentence in 19 years. "I have a photographic memory, Father," Grace corrected, a dangerous, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "I spent a decade sitting silently in your library. You thought I was staring blankly at the walls. In reality, I was reading your private ledgers. I memorized every corporate loophole, every illegal kickback, every bribe you funneled through Western Pacific Logistics, and every vulnerability in your entire, rotten empire." Emerson's eyes widened in sheer, unadulterated terror as the devastating truth finally clicked into place. The invisible ghost, the anonymous tips, the perfectly timed leaks. It was you, Emerson breathed, his knees suddenly weak. You leaked the tunnel routes to Jay Gould. You triggered the federal audits in Washington. I merely leveled the playing field, Grace said, her tone devoid of any sympathy or hesitation. You sent me to Iron Creek assuming the harsh winter would kill me, leaving you free to steal Caleb's land over my frozen body. Instead, I used my husband's name to legally purchase the distressed debts of your transport shell companies while they plummeted in value. Grace tapped a manicured finger against the top document on the desk. You don't own the freight lines in Sweetwater County anymore. Father, Caleb and I do. We also own the water rights to the lower valley. Sterling hastily grabbed the documents, his eyes darting frantically across the legalese. He looked up at Emerson, his face ashen. Mr. Pendleton, she's telling the truth. The holding company registered to Lawson owns the controlling interest. Furthermore, she filed an addendum nullifying the reversion clause in the marriage contract 3 months ago, citing your documented illegal coercion. You have absolutely no power here. Emerson! Caleb stepped forward, placing a protective, loving hand on the small of Grace's back. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. You are broke in Wyoming. Your stocks are crashing in California. And if you or your hired guns ever set foot near my wife or my ranch again, she will mail the rest of your private, unredacted ledgers straight to the federal prosecutor. I suggest you get back on your train. Emerson Pendleton stared at the daughter he had treated as subhuman garbage for nearly 2 decades. He saw his own ruthless, brilliant intellect staring back at him, refined and sharpened by years of silent suffering and abuse. He had built a massive fortune on crushing the weak, only to be utterly dismantled, humiliated, and bankrupted by the one person he thought was the weakest of them all. Without a word. A broken, defeated Emerson, Pendleton turned and walked slowly out of the bank, looking suddenly like a very old, very fragile man. Sterling and the Pinkertons scrambled after him, eager to distance themselves from a sinking ship. The silence in the bank lobby was deafening, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Caleb looked down at Grace, a massive, awe-struck grin breaking across his rugged face. He pulled her close, not caring who saw. Well, Mrs. Lawson, Caleb murmured, his eyes shining with profound admiration and deep, abiding love. I believe we have a cattle ranch to run. Grace smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that reached her eyes the eyes of a free woman. Yes, we do, Caleb, and a railroad to build. Over the next decade, Iron Creek grew into the largest, most prosperous cattle and freight empire in the Wyoming Territory. Caleb provided the brawn, the heart, and the unwavering loyalty, while Grace provided the brilliant, untouchable strategy that kept their rivals at bay. They built a legacy not on cruelty or exploitation, but on an unbreakable partnership, turning a malicious banishment into the greatest love story the West had ever known. And Emerson Pendleton faded into bitter obscurity, haunted forever by the silence of the daughter who finally found her voice. If this story of betrayal, brilliant revenge, and unexpected love kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this Wild West drama with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more incredible real-life stories where the underdogs outsmart the giants. What would you have done in Grace's shoes? Tell us in the comments below.